Thank you for joining us this evening for this conversation about book banning. Free access to information goes to the core of what libraries offer. It's why we gather here tonight and why millions of people across the country visit their libraries. We hope that you continue to value the idea that when you visit us in the future. On behalf of the DC Public Library, I'd like to thank our partners at NBC News for hosting this event. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you the host of NBC's Meet the Press, Chuck Todd.
All right. Thank you, thank you. Well, let's bring out the real stars of this here. Antonia Hilton is a correspondent for both NBC News and MSNBC. She covers the intersection of politics, civil rights, immigration. She's doing a lot of work for us at Meet the Press as well. We've worked with her quite a bit for Meet the Press Reports. She's done some terrific reporting. She's also our beat reporter on one of our important races and regions that we're focusing on this year in North Carolina. And in her spare time, she's writing a book about something that's not on any of her beats, about Crownsville State Hospital and Asylum in Anne Arundel County that closed in 2004. So be looking for that. If you've enjoyed Antonia's reporting, you know this is going to be an outstanding look at that topic. Mike Hicksabah is also a senior investigative reporter for us at NBC News. He's based in Houston, Texas. He covers stories across all over the Southwest. We're pretty proud at NBC now that we are going back old school. Not everybody has to be based in DC and Washington anymore, as we know. Outside, it's America, as I like to say every once in a while. South Lake, the podcast that many of you probably are very familiar with, I hope, is his second hit podcast that he's hosted. The first one that he did for us, Do No Harm. It was a 6-episode show that followed a family caught in the Texas child welfare system. So, Antonia and Mike, we're tired of saying good things about you. Why don't you come on out? All right, so we're in a library. How many books are going to be left in this library that we can check out if certain people get in power? Let me start with what is the biggest, yet another scoop out of Texas in the school systems here that you guys are responsible for, and that is the most recent recording. And I think you guys said South Lake School District has banned recording by employees these days?
That is correct, yes.
That's right.
Well done.
We effected a policy change in South Lake.
But the school superintendent basically said out loud what this entire operation really is, which is simply, he gathered, I'm hoping I'm setting the scene correctly, he gathered all the librarians of the school district for a meeting, and he said, this is a conservative area. And essentially led with that, implying that if the book doesn't match a conservative ideology, it shouldn't be in the library.
That's right, and this was in a school district not far from South Lake in North Texas, where, in the community, 81% of residents voted for Donald Trump, and so it is a conservative community, but the superintendent made it explicit that in this community we're conservative, and that means we're not going to have books not only on sex, but he went further and said we're not going to have books that deal with other LGBTQ issues that have nothing to do with sex. He said there are two genders. There's male and there's female. I know some people women might think they're a man, some men might think they're women, but here this is an academic institution and we're going to act as such. There's no room for that in our libraries. And that really follows a pattern that we've seen in recent months where some of the book challenges that are spreading across the country, where it's now become explicitly anti-LGBTQ, that if you have this type of content for children or young children, librarians are being accused of grooming children. And it's really part of this movement of conflating sex with sexual orientation. And so that's what we were seeing in that recording.
Well, what's sad about that was a movement, Antonia, that is what forced many gay and lesbian Americans into hiding for a century, was this, and here we go again.
That's right. And for many folks, they feel like what's old is somehow new again right now. And that comes when it comes to LGBTQ issues in books and also race. What was interesting coming out of that recording that Mike first got from that superintendent is many of the students that we'd spoken to in Southlake heard that and reacted to that news and were like, yeah, this was what we knew all along. And we now have it on tape, but they really weren't frankly surprised.
So this was never about, it's funny, this all started with critical race theory,
Yep.
so-called critical race theory. And now we've morphed it into this, it's morphed on the right to this attempt to essentially purge. Now it's going after LGBTQ. What's next?
Well, I think, honestly, LGBTQ issues are going to continue to be on the forefront, but race is still very much in the mix. I mean, critical race theory is still at the center of this, too. And I think, actually, we want to share a clip with folks from Southlake for anyone here in the audience who hasn't listened to the series yet. What you're about to hear is a moment from our second episode that is one of the most emotional, it's a moment that we get a lot of feedback from listeners from. It's a student named Raven Roll in the district who is in a principal's office with her principal and another peer, a white male student who she's just overheard using the N-word. And when me and Mike first heard this audio, our jaws kind of dropped because it really brings you into the hallways of what's actually been happening at schools. It cuts through a lot of the noise around what critical race theory even means or why schools might need to talk about race and diversity in the first place. And it really, it almost speaks for itself. So take a listen.
This happens way too often in school. Am I supposed to get up and leave every time I hear someone say that?
Well, to
That is
me, it's
correct. You should,
just,
and that's why we're trying to work through this and educate, because this has got to be a safe place for learning.
Yeah.
Because she's entitled to a classroom and to a seat in that class just like everybody else. So she shouldn't have to get up and leave.
well, to me, it's just a word, so it doesn't affect
It's not just a word. Don't even say that.
Yeah.
Do you know what that means? How are you gonna look at me in my face
Hold on,
and tell me that that is just a word? Do you know how disrespectful that is?
To me, it's just a
No,
word.
it's not just a word.
Yeah, it's not.
That is a racial slur. I can't even believe you would just say that to me.
Raven,
I'm not gonna calm down.
just
I
relax.
cannot deal with this ignorance.
Just relax.
There's no words that offend me.
Cause you're white.
What is that?
That's why. I'm black and I have to go to school in this white school and listen to y'all say that and you're gonna tell me it's just a word?
It doesn't.
It's not just a word.
Have a seat out there for me for a second.
Sure.
Thank you.
Alone with Raven after sending the boy away, Duhan at first tries to comfort her.
So you see the word ignorance, you said it. That's what we're dealing with. I'm not sure, Raven. I'm not sure if that kid will ever change.
He's not going to.
And then
So, one thing that you hear there, it sounds like the principal wishes they could be educating them on this. It's sort of an interesting to hear, well, this is why we need it, and I'm thinking, oh, he's advocating. What is he advocating
Well,
there?
this is exactly
I mean, I don't,
why the way we wanted to center our reporting on moments like that to kind of, before we got into the critical race theory debate and panic that's spread in 2020 and 2021. You know, that was from 2019, and
this is pre-COVID, pre-George Floyd.
right,
Yeah.
right, and this is what school districts across the country were working to address. And the clip cut a little bit short there, but you'll hear the principal actually even saying, giving the student advice that you can't let this kid get under your skin. You're too pretty, you're too nice to get angry when you hear someone using that kind of language. And so what we've seen across the country is attempts in school districts to do kind of training for educators and for students to try to head that off. And so we really wanted to make that the baseline, the foundation for the story we were telling so that we could put what's happening now in that context.
I gotta ask, I mean, to get that recording, I mean, without it, it's an academic discussion. With it, you suddenly, we all everybody, I don't want to speak for everybody in this room, I would assume we've all been in a principal's office once. Okay? I'm like, maybe you were on the good side of being in the principal's office. But that's a tough place to be. We all know it. We were at that certain age. Thank God you got the recording.
Well, I think what's interesting about the recording, and one thing that I think unsettles people about it, is because there is this aspect of familiarity. Everyone's been in the principal's office. Everyone said something they shouldn't have said at school. But then there's also this aspect that keeps coming up in our reporting, whether it's around LGBTQ issues or race, of people not fully grasping what children actually hear at school every day. The reality of what marginalized kids experience in the hallways of our public schools. And this disconnect between some of the parents, or even in some cases, students who want to believe that for the most part, no one would ever say these kinds of things, use these words, they don't know about these topics. But the truth being that when you talk to students like Raven and other kids we met in Southlake, they say they heard the N-word multiple times a week in the hallway. They described what you heard on tape there as not being that strange. When you talk to LGBTQ students in the district, they say they were called the F slur constantly, that kids made fun of them for joining the Gay Straight Alliance Club. And so on the one side, there's parents and politicians saying, we don't really need to talk about this because it's not really happening that much. You're the one, by talking about it, bringing it into the school district. And then there's kids who are literally recording saying, hey, this is a real thing I'm experiencing every single day. And what's, I think, unsettling for folks sometimes is when you put that in their face, there's not much they can do about it. There's not much to refute there.
What was distressing to me is the principal was making the mistake of saying that the marginalized kid is the one that has to take the higher ground. Everybody's heard that. There is an exhaustion from asking those that are attacked to take the high ground. And this is why perhaps educators need some new tools.
Yeah, and so we, in our reporting, obviously, this started with this fight over critical race theory, right? Or what opponents of critical race theory are calling critical race theory. But it's obviously now shifted, and we've done a lot of reporting in Texas and across the country on what began this past fall with this new assault on library books, where it's one thing to, according to educators we've talked to come in and say, we don't like this curriculum, we don't like this active instruction that you're doing to try to educate kids on history. It's different when you start getting into what books belong in a library, what kids can read, what they can have free time access to. And I know you deal with this, Tiff, when we were talking backstage. Like, what is a library? What is it? Is it supposed to be? Is it supposed to be a safe space for only conservative ideas or only liberal ideas? Or
A library is for everyone. If we weren't, then why would we be here?
What's the word public mean, right?
Right.
I mean,
if it's not right.
I mean, at that point, what wouldn't you want to put? I mean, look, I get a school library has one set of parameters. You have a different set of parameters, but at the end of the day, it's a public library.
Absolutely is. And it is not our choice. Like, we don't make the choice. What we do is we provide the material, and parents make the choices with their children. That's the extension of a conversation. I'm a parent. My child hears a lot. She's in middle school. When she comes home, we have a discussion about it. We talk about it. What's good? What feels good? What doesn't feel good? I talked about, at this age of 11 and 12, children are especially vulnerable because they're trying to figure out who they are. They're trying to figure out if the feelings that they have towards another person is safe. Why do they have to feel like that? They should be able to come, school, I get it. They have a curriculum. We don't have a curriculum. But, we make sure we have content in our collections that support anyone who can come in, whether we agree. It's not about an agreement. It really is about access. And sometimes what I think we forget as adults is that, going back to children and youth being vulnerable, they only have each other to talk to, and that's not always the best.
No.
So we need to be able to provide the material.
I am, the
To
thing,
support.
I will tell you the biggest takeaway I've had of all your reporting out of Southlake is if I lived in Southlake and I had a child that I was concerned was going to get marginalized in some way, for some reason, I wouldn't put him in the public schools there. I'd try to get him out. And that is my fear here, that actually the goal of the school districts here is that, yeah, people want to segregate by ideology now. Like we're heading into a form of segregation again on education. Are you, what kind of impact is the Southlake community feeling now? Now that I think it's pretty clear, if you are potentially a marginalized member of a marginalized community in Southlake, you're not, if you can get out of that school system, that might be the best advice.
It's
Not every parent
interesting.
can afford it, but if you could, you might want to get out.
It's a conversation we've had with a lot of the students that we've spoken to in the series. The student Raven, who you just heard from in that audio, she goes off to college. She becomes almost inspired by the experience that she has. She wants to be a journalist now. She makes TikToks constantly, responding to what's said at her local school board meetings, gets into fights with parents on social media. But then Nikki Olaleye, another student, another Black student who just graduated from the school district, she took some of the approach that you just described. Her parents immediately put their home up for sale. And when I asked them why, they were like, we don't feel safe here. She's graduating, we need to get out. And Nikki has essentially told me, I'm glad I took part in this series, but I don't really want to think about that place anymore. I want to put it behind me. I'm in a new college, I'm making new friends, and I want to close that chapter. And for me, she's a really smart, kind, funny person. You do think about what happens when people like Nikki want to leave and never see a place again. What's happened?
And we reported recently on a 12-year-old student whose mom made the choice to pull him out of the school after he confided with to some classmates that he identifies as pansexual. He says he endured very aggressive bullying and taunts for across 2 different school years, and it culminated in him voicing his desire not to live anymore. And kids, he said, responded by bringing a rope out to the recess and stringing it over a goalpost in the form of a noose. And so his mom pulled him out of school, got him psychiatric care that he needed. He's doing better. He sat down with us. But now he goes to private school, and they can afford to do that. But it's not just students and parents who are caught up in this. Educators and librarians we're seeing more and more questioning this job that they maybe used to love, wondering, do I want to keep doing this? Do I want to keep fighting with
This is what,
with
we
parents?
just did, we've done multiple part series on this at Meet the Press Reports. And that was sort of the heart of a school board member out of Reno, Nevada, he decided to quit. But he's got a substitute teaching certificate because they're desperate for teachers. And he felt like he had to, and he said administrators, teachers are leaving because they feel as if they can't do their job, right? Antonio?
Well, we actually have another clip we want to share with you all. Mike and I sat down with a recently retired head librarian in Southlake. And she, really fits this mold of someone who had enjoyed her long career there and didn't imagine she'd end up stepping out of the field and retiring in this way. Take a listen to what she experienced.
Meanwhile, the battle over which books should be allowed in schools was intensifying, and not just in Southlake.
Look at our libraries. Propaganda works on impressionable minds.
Parents, including that mom in Katy, Texas, were packing school board meetings to read and comment on passages from library books meant for teenagers, including this graphic novel featuring a transgender child.
It is The Breakaways by Kathy Johnson. They're kissing, they're looking at each other, they're touching each other's hands. 5th graders. You're my best friend. Can I tell you something? Yeah? I think I'm a boy. I feel better. I'm glad you trust me. So then they end up kissing. This is in 7 of our junior high schools.
In some instances, parents even claimed that these books were leading kids to improperly question their sexuality and gender identity.
How does this happen? Why are we sexualizing our precious children.
Texas Governor Greg Abbott took it further. In a letter to the Texas Education Agency, he called for criminal investigations into any school official who stocked library shelves with books that include descriptions of sex, which he described as pornography.
How do you defend yourself against a charge of pornography or something like that?
And of course, all of this was trickling down to educators in Southlake.
I mean, that is reputation destroying. You know, we kind of live in a society where, you know, people make a decision about who and what you are before you can defend yourself.
In January, Mike and I returned to Southlake and met with someone who'd witnessed some of the fighting going on behind the scenes at Carroll. We met at a hotel about a mile from the high school.
My name is Sarah Chase, and I have been the librarian at Carroll Senior High School for the last 19 and a half years.
Actually, Sarah was the librarian at Carroll Senior High. She'd retired a month earlier and was still getting used to describing her career in the past tense. She hadn't planned to walk away in the middle of a school year.
I guess probably around October, I decided, that's it. I don't need to do this anymore.
Sarah says she loved her job. She loved the feeling of handing a book to a kid and watching them fall in love with it. That was especially true for her students of color and LGBTQ kids, who weren't always used to seeing themselves reflected in the books they were assigned to read for class.
Kids need to see themselves in books. The world is incredibly diverse. The kids need to see that. And I think it's really helpful when they can read a book and put themselves in the place of that main character and experience what somebody else is experiencing. Walk a mile in somebody else's shoes, kind of thing, virtually through a book. It's very important.
Did you feel supported in that mission for most of your time there?
Absolutely. I used to. This last, semester or whatever, I felt quite a bit differently about it. I started second guessing a lot of the things I used to do. I felt if a parent complained or something to anybody above campus, that we might not be supported. It was a very scary feeling. When you read newspaper stories and online stories about districts where parents have taken books directly to the police and asked for criminal charges to be brought against the school and or the librarian for using words like, obscenity and pornography. How scary is that?
I'm going to go somewhere that maybe some people will say I'm making a leap here, but I can't help but hear some of the conspiratorial nature of the right-wing politics that's happening these days with QAnon and this sort of obsession with everything's a pedophile, everyone's a pedophile, and that how much that is seeping in because we're seeing, this didn't happen by accident, right? We've had book banning discussions before, okay? I'm old enough, I think Mark Twain was on the list for a while, okay? I mean, we've had these debates in previous generations. This is different and where it's coming from, and it all just, again, I'm the political reporter here. You guys are knee-deep in the education. Am I off base?
No, I think it's lots of people are seeing that connection. Mm-hmm. Because what we've seen, is, especially in the last few months in Florida, critics of legislation there dubbed it the Don't Say Gay bill. Mm-hmm. On the right, they're calling it the anti-grooming bill. And what we're seeing is in there, if you say that you think it's appropriate to talk to students, children, teenagers about sexuality, sexual orientation, LGBTQ
You're the groomer.
issues, you're the groomer.
You're the pedophile.
So the librarians are being accused of grooming children.
By the way,
term.
Mike is not. I say this because I half joke, but these days
Well, no,
somebody
look,
will take that clip and you'll
I-
get character assassination.
I've interviewed LGBTQ teenagers, and because of that, I've been accused of grooming kids. Like a threat was made against me for interviewing LGBTQ kids about what it's like to be a kid in school these days. These accusations come very quickly, and we've seen some of the groups pushing.
Feels driven by social media.
Yeah,
and specifically the QAnon.
We've seen some of the groups pushing that rhetoric go so far as to then explicitly talk about QAnon stuff. Like, the schools are doing this as part of this global movement, started under Obama with you know, whatever federal policy that they were pushing it with Arne Duncan, and now, you know, this is the next step toward getting kids round up for.
Well, it's how you
international sex
dehumanize a
trafficking.
librarian. You want to dehumanize somebody quickly? Accuse them of being a groomer and a pedophile.
Well, yeah.
That's what we'll do in society. I mean, this is dangerous stuff.
What's also been interesting to me at times is you and I have done so much of this reporting hand in hand. I mean, like literally going into the field and spending days doing these interviews together. And when people have lodged those criticisms or attacks on us, for me, it always comes as, you know, you're the BLM activist. You know, you are the diversity hire set out to do this story about South Lake. And then Mike kind of is
How does that work?
Even
Yeah.
though I've also interviewed LGBTQ minors. you
You're
know.
not the groomer.
I'm not the groomer.
You're the minority
but
activist.
Yes.
He's the groomer. I got
Yes,
it. Okay.
yeah.
Glad we sorted it out. Great. Can't wait till that gets cut down.
I know,
Yeah.
right? And trim. I am just curious, are any of these conspiracy theorists getting into your kitchen?
Oh, they come to the library.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, earlier you said it's the public, so we get everyone.
Yeah, you do get everyone, right? Good,
And
good, bad,
because-
or the cuddly, and we'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Absolutely. But, you know, one thing I think it's important to remember when it comes to this is libraries support education by offering materials and books and allowing people to go deeper into topics.
Right.
And many families and students who want to know more about history that's taught in school, they come into libraries.
Because the school library won't have the book.
Right.
Right? You know, that's why I showed up to the library as a kid, right? Oh, that book's not there, let's go to the public library, maybe they have it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this really is particularly true for people of color.
Right.
So what do? We're driven into places where we can find the information. And that's where we're available for people. So, you know, this is why it's important that the libraries have the proper support, because the thing about it is our librarians are not prepared to deal with political backlash.
Well, and neither was
librarians.
neither was a school library, right? Let me ask you this, Antonia. These are taxpayer-funded facilities, the school libraries here. Where's the activism on the other side? It's just not that many. Are these communities that cloistered, and there's really only a handful of people? Those that might argue that the public school needs to be a space for everybody, that you have to, you know, is it just too small of a community to fight?
I think you're right. In some communities, perhaps they are in the minority. I don't think generally they are. I mean, when you look at the makeup of public schools, they actually primarily serve
More
disproportionate.
diverse than the population, than
Exactly.
the current population, right?
Yeah, and poor students and students who depend on things like free and reduced lunch. And then what I've always found interesting is when you look at the patterns of the people at the front lines of this fight, though, they have a lot of money to donate to these new PACs that have formed around this. They have the leisure time to form groups, to meet in book clubs and read about LGBTQ stories and then organize themselves to go to school board meetings and read portions of those stories. Parents who are doing that are not representative of necessarily your average public school parent. And so some of what we're seeing in terms of the loudest voices who are representing that opposition side, they are not representative of parents, because some people can't make it to a 5 p.m. school board meeting on a Monday night. So when are they gonna get to say their piece? And if you can't compete with someone who can donate $100,000 to, your local PAC that's going to start getting involved in the school board races, where are you getting your voice? And so you're right, there's a lopsidedness there, but that doesn't mean that voice hasn't been there. A lot of them are trying to raise their hands. We've spoken with them. I know our colleague Kate Snow spoke to some folks, but even
She's
in
had-
her story, he
but-
admitted they don't have money. They
I
have
mean,
a
it was
budget
astonishing,
of
yes.
$0.
Moms for Liberty has $500,000 and promises, Moms for Liberty, on the conservative side, I don't know if I had to explain it, but we know that the word liberty's been hijacked these days. And then the group that was fighting it was like, yeah, we don't have any money.
You're just doing it when
I go
you
to
can.
Staples, another person, goes.
Same thing in South Lake, though. Some of the folks, they've raised a bit of money, but nowhere near as much. And then, they're printing out T-shirts, doing what they can, hanging out. It's just not the same level of coordination and funding.
Let me ask, because we've talked about critical race theory, and this has been an effort. to figure out how do we better educate our kids on race. I am ignorant on this. Is there a good organization, good resources for LGBTQ for schools, and where do library, what is the resource? Maybe you have a better idea. What resource do you go to find good books on helping young kids?
We definitely, this is where I rely pretty much on my director of collections, who has great relationships with the vendors. When
Sure.
we think about diverse collections and to have the correct material, I go straight to Cheryl because Cheryl is the one who knows. She's building the relationship. She knows the content. They're doing the research. And that's really the most important at this moment. But we go to our local vendors and we let them know what we need, and that we need to have everything in the collection.
And Tony, what have you guys discovered on this front?
Well, one thing we've heard frequently from students is that they just want a seat at the table about these issues. Yeah. They want to talk about the books that they'd like to read.
There's at least talk on race. Like whatever way, there's always talk on improving race education. Yeah. We're having a big debate over it, but with LGBTQ, there's not general acceptance.
There's a funny moment in the South Lake podcast, actually, that we never get to talk about that much, where students who get to join this diversity committee that came up with the diversity plan that kicked off the whole fight there, they meet with administrators and parents and volunteers to start working on the diversity plan. And one of the exercises that they come up with, not the students, but one of the administrators, is to take every slur, both racial and, gender and sexual identity, and put them in order of most offensive to least offensive.
It was a group activity.
A group
We all worked together to rank them.
Who decides what's offensive?
Right.
I think it's, talk about the ultimate subjective.
You can see where this is going.
A queer student described to us while cackling. I mean, she had to pause multiple times while doing this interview with us. How she and her friend kind of got into a tussle with an older woman who was trying to tell them that a certain slur was worse, but this woman was straight and they were actually queer, and they were disagreeing about where this slur went. And it was one of those things that kind of, it's like a parody of these liberal groups that are trying their hardest to do this, but often have people who don't have enough expertise in it themselves running them. But one thing that was interesting about it to me was that the students weren't really offended by this moment. They thought, ultimately, the messiness, at least people were open to a conversation, open to learning, open to disagreeing. Yeah, some embarrassing stuff happened in that session, but her takeaway wasn't, and now I never want to talk to these adults who said this thing or insulted me in this way or whatever. This was kind of funny, and it was the beginning of an interesting and messy process.
The other thing that's been a lifeline for LGBTQ kids in schools are, student clubs like the Gay Straight Alliance and these groups that are often teacher-led, but, students, it's a safe space for students to come and talk among their peers.
How much now do a teacher may not want to get involved because if a parent, look what you're going through, simply interviewing it.
Well, that's exactly what's happening, is these clubs are coming under attack. Schools are disbanding them. Teachers who've led these groups have been accused of grooming kids and have, in some cases, been suspended or resigned. And so these clubs that exist for that purpose are also under attack.
The federal government had to force schools to desegregate. Do you imagine we're going to get to a point where we're going to have to force these public schools? We're seeing what's happening in Texas. They're taking this to a next level where each town wants to ban abortion and each town wants to ban, for all we know, you're going to see attempts to ban same-sex marriage. No, we don't do it in this town. We don't do this in this town. And this sort of weird form of political segregation is coming. Is there a role for the federal government here?
So one of the things we recently reported on in South Lake, because South Lake's always ahead of the curve on this stuff.
Ahead or behind, right?
I don't know.
Your podcast is ahead of the curve. What you're covering.
No comment.
Often when the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights is called in to investigate a school district, and if there's accusations of discrimination based on race or gender or sexuality, their remedy that they force districts to do is to implement the types of diversity, equity, inclusion programs that have been branded as critical race theory. And so in South Lake, we're literally seeing what could be this town voted to get rid of any kind of diversity training. And the federal government is currently investigating the school district. And at the end, the Biden administration could end up requiring this district to do some of this work anyway. So this could happen across the country.
Well, I mean, I'm having visions of, we got some questions from the audience. I think we're getting ready for audience questions, but I have visions of, for some people, I'm going to say the words Little Rock, Arkansas, right? I mean, I feel like that's where we're headed here, a moment where there's going to be this moment where they'll resist the federal government's ruling.
I would not be surprised if that happened.
I think we have some audience questions. All right. Excellent. We got somebody coming down here. We'll collect the cards. Sorry that we're doing cards, but you know, there's only. Oh yeah. That's right. Let me ask you
Which
this:
is
can
digital.
we? My knowledge of the Dewey Decimal System, does it still matter?
Yes, it does.
Okay. I want to know that everything I learned about the Dewey Decimal System is still, it's a brilliant system.
is.
I've always been weirdly obsessed with databases. So the Dewey Decimal System was the blockchain before we had one.
I love it.
All right. Here's one. Progressives say that schools aren't teaching critical race theory. But aren't they teaching, in a sense, what critical race theory espouses? How do you thread that needle? Well, it gets to, I think, what we heard the principal. They don't have critical race theory, but he sounds like he's saying, boy, we got to educate on race. If you're doing education on race, everybody, is that automatically critical race theory? I mean, I guess that's what we're headed here. So answer that question.
This is the type, this makes it, this argument over definition, it makes it very difficult to cover this subject. Because I feel like we found this, that the response from the left and from parents just generally is these schools aren't teaching critical race theory, and then on the right they're saying they don't mean literally critical race theory. What they mean is this general philosophy that is kind of very broad. And I saw, we were just at an education conference in Austin, and I saw throughout their program lots of courses on embracing critical race theory among educators, on redefining the conversation and just saying, like, here's what critical race theory is and isn't, and here's why, yes, it actually should inform some of our approaches to education. And I think that's a shift that we've seen in the last few months.
Is the phrase toxic?
And that was the goal.
Right, they wanted to make the phrase toxic, so is it one of those, I'm trying to think of another, it's hard to come up with another phrase, something where the phrase became, I mean, I'll make a cheap political statement. Obamacare versus what was in, right? You know, right. Obamacare became this negative, but everybody loved what was in it. So critical race theory has become polarizing. But then when you tell people what it does, Antonio, people are like, oh yeah, that's a good idea.
Well, and there's also a moving goalpost here, which is some of what you were just getting at. I mean, not to be that person who goes back to the original definition, but you know, this is something developed decades ago by Black and Latino legal scholars, really was for graduate students. Maybe some people in college would get some exposure to it. And so this idea that real critical race theory is in schools, I think now at this stage in the reporting, people understand it's really not. But the terms have been stretched, I mean, to the point where now even LGBTQ issues are being labeled as critical race theory, which is not really what these scholars were talking about. Right. And
but the opponents don't have time to differentiate for nuance.
Right. I mean, it's just
a lot easier to lump it all into
people
one.
During the Ketanji Brown hearings last week, I mean, everyone saw the GOP, the official GOP tweet labeling her, they crossed out her name, her initials of her name, and replaced it with CRT, which people were sort of, what are you saying here? Her whole existence is critical race theory? Do words have meaning anymore?
It felt like they just did it because, oh, she's an African-American nominee. I mean, let's just say what it is. I mean, I didn't know what other reason they did it for.
I mean, we heard her repeatedly say that it has absolutely nothing to do with her day-to-day work as a judge.
Right.
But
that's what I mean. There was no substance to it. So what other reason was there? What other motivation?
And it's been a major challenge for Democrats because they are in this really tough position of trying to fight back against all of this rhetoric, but also defend principles of critical race theory. They do believe, for the most part, in diversity and inclusion programs. They do want to fight for more minority representation in schools and reading materials. They do think that workplaces need to have some kind of training to address bias and discrimination. So how do you defend those things which have been labeled critical race theory, but then also say you're not advocating for critical race theory? It's become an impossible position.
One other overly simplistic question I have for you, which is, if COVID doesn't shut the schools down, is this a tempest that stays in the teapot?
I mean, we did see that. It's hard to know. But in Southlake and in other school districts, what was happening that summer was parents were, during virtual school, they were listening to kids' lessons. There were several stories that have come up where the teacher said something during a virtual class and the parent overheard it.
It's a good idea when you overhear something to immediately assume the truth. That's what makes a good reporter. Oh, wait, no, that's not what you do. You check the source, you double check, anyway.
And then the other thing is parents were keyed into these school board meetings and trying to figure out when is virtual school going to end, what's the mask policy, and then they're passing, they're incorporating diversity plans or passing resolutions, making a statement about the murder of George Floyd and racial justice that summer, and there was blowback to that, and everyone was paying attention to schools. So I'm sure it's related.
There's some. Tiffany, I got a question for you.
Okay.
You said public libraries are here to supplement school libraries. So the question is, as you watch more school libraries come under pressure, are you guys having to do do you feel that you're going to have to expand your offerings for under 18?
That's a good question.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I definitely think that we should look into it.
Perhaps in this community, in this larger community, this is going to be less of an issue. But,
right. But in general, we should look to, because to my point earlier, we are the supplement. So we work collegially with our education partners, and we also work with our parents to ensure that the children are receiving what they need. But I think we should.
I saw that the last time I was in Texas. I was in
the public libraries,
a public library in Austin had signs all over it saying, LGBTQ students, books representing you here. They even had phone lines.
Yeah, what about in the
saying,
That's
if
Austin.
You need to have a private
All
conversation
right, that's
with the
Austin.
library.
That's in the little blue dot of Texas. What about the Metroplex?
But they were saying.
The good thing about here is I participated with the Equity Lab, the Seed and Disruption cohort, and which the Seed and Disruption cohort is trying to penetrate educational and any institution or agency that deals with youth, so that there is equity, right? Like that children and parents and leaders know exactly where to go and who to connect with. So there are opportunities to do exactly what you say and to create these safe spaces and clubs for youth to come in and be able to talk and connect with people. I mean, one of the things that we're about is building relationships with our customers. I mean, no matter who you are, we're welcoming. We come in, we provide information, we make sure we have not just books, but resources that we connect you with. And if it's something you want to do on your own, you have the opportunity to sign up, go on a computer, take a book, read it in a study space. It's really important to have these resources, to your point, and make people feel like, especially youth. I'm a teen librarian, so everything I do, even though I'm an administrator at this point, everything I do.
Is there a process? If somebody walks in and says, you know what, I don't think my tax dollars should have this book. And, the easiest one would be a Mein Kampf, right? I think there's sort of this like, all right.
Right.
But is there a process with which if somebody says, hey, will you review this book?
Yes,
Okay,
and
yeah.
recently we had this with, it was the Anne Frank book, which we moved, what is it? The Anne Frank book, from history to conspiracy.
Okay.
Right? So, sometimes we just revisit where it belongs, but we didn't take it out the collection.
Gotcha. All right, here's a question from somebody in the audience. I was arrested in the 60s for going to an all-white library. I was 15 years old at the time. Where are the activist youth and youth leaders? Antonia?
Well, they're not getting arrested in libraries right now.
They
But
definitely are, right?
they're starting groups in Texas. All kinds of school districts now have groups of students, LGBTQ students, Black students, who are forming coalitions. They're making banned book clubs where they basically find all the books that their school has taken off the shelves over the last couple months, and they're getting kids together to read them. They are protesting at school board meetings. They are directly, in some cases, confronting the parents in their community who are parts of some of these groups or political organizations that are pushing for this. So there are absolutely kids who are out on the front lines of this fight. And often
marching to the Capitol in Florida and
Right.
protesting.
And I don't want to presume where some of your sources are, but I assume students have been among your sources.
Oh, I mean,
That's
at
a form
time-
of, I would call that a form of activism, right?
Yeah, and some of them speaking at great risk to themselves.
Right.
You know, Mike spoke with a queer student for one of his stories who, you know, had to have their identity concealed because they hadn't come out to their family yet.
Wow.
And so some of these students are seeing what's happening in their community. Their parents are not even aware of the emotional toll that it's taking on them, and they're reaching out to reporters. They're finding a way to get their voice out there. And so, you know, I can understand why sometimes people would say, oh, kids should be doing more or need to be out there. But in this case, there are a lot of communities, big and small, kids doing the best that they can in the circumstances that they're in right now.
I want to talk about teachers here. One of the people we had on our show, on our episode last week, we had a teacher who taught at a majority black school in Jacksonville, Florida, had a Black Lives Matter flag. She's a white teacher, had a Black Lives Matter flag hanging in her classroom for 6 to 8 months. And she was told to take it down and then was sent to teacher jail, and she's never taught again. By the way, majority black high school, the high school's name, it's been changed, but when she was teaching there, Robert E. Lee High School, home of the Generals. So the teacher stress, the teacher tension here, where they're caught in the middle. They're there, you go into teaching, you're the third parent, okay? At the end of the day, it is, right? For that hour, or maybe it's 6 hours, whatever, if it's elementary, middle. And in some cases, and many teachers embrace this, understanding the limits and the parameters. If I were a teacher now, I'd be scared out of my mind to, you know, if a child comes up, maybe something's not, you know, especially somebody who's, I think they're going to be afraid to act.
Well, I think there's been so much focus, rightfully so, on the legislation and policies that have been debated and enacted across the country. But there's a softer self-censorship, and there's lots of commentary about self-censorship now in the media, but...
We're doing it all the time. I'm not gonna,
Yeah.
we thanks to social media,
Well,
it's
but-
made, people in this room self-censor themselves
Right.
more than you've ever
Well, now,
before.
but now
because of
teachers
what
have in the
happened.
back of their mind, if I teach this
Look,
lesson...
I got that guy taking pictures of us from outside. And I say this, we wave, hello. No, but my point is, that's the thing, right? We're you know, you never know when somebody's watching.
Well,
Or
but
listening.
now the pressure is you could lose your job for stating that sentence, or you could... if
This
you
teacher
include
lost her
this
job
lesson. Right.
for simply hanging a Black Lives Matter
Right, so even if the policies aren't changed in some of these places, the laws aren't changed, teachers are thinking twice about talking openly about America's racial legacy, for example. And so I think what we're seeing and hearing from educators all over the country is, you know, self-censorship. Like, we're not going to touch this subject in my history class. Or
Look, I now realize that my public education was diluted, watered down, and it takes you a while. Once you go to college, you sort of get it. I had a parent who was and would say, oh, they're blowing through that issue. That's not really how it went. But not, everybody. But it feels like that's what a bunch of white parents are trying to do in these conservative towns, which is, let's just water down our history and tell a version that makes us feel better.
I mean, there's a movement and legislation on the books that requires a patriotic teaching of Texas history in Texas. You know, like
Will somebody define, what is the definition of patriotic education?
the guys at the Alamo were the good guys. That's, you know.
It's patriotic to protest. It's patriotic to get arrested at a white library.
Right.
That's patriotism.
I had this conversation
By the
with,
way.
I had this conversation with Kimberly Crenshaw, who is one of the founders of critical race theory, asking her about the fact that people say that she hates America, she's not patriotic. And, she basically was talking about these two different definitions of patriotism, that on one side, it's America is the greatest thing that ever happened. This idea that the bad things have happened are because of bad apples. And for the most part, it's been this noble movement since its founding. And then for her, that her version of patriotism is to ask America to live up to all of its ideals. That criticism is actually a form of respect, of looking forward into the future of what this country could be. And so she basically said that there's two versions of what patriotism is in America. And I asked her, does she think people are going to eventually get to a place where they come to an agreement? And she wasn't sure.
I'm more optimistic. America's an idea. I'm more optimistic about that. I do think eventually people will realize that, but there are people who don't think America's an idea. It's essentially a European colony that should always remain a year. Antonio, I didn't ask you to do this, but politically, you're covering an interesting community for us where you're, I think, seeing what happens maybe when you compromise too much on education. You're in Anson County, North Carolina. This is a 50-50 county, a rural county, 50-50 African-American white. And you were talking about how many of the black educators and black administrators have to speak in code a little bit in trying to sort of navigate life there.
Yeah.
Walk me through that, because this feels very connected, that side.
It's a fascinating small rural community close to the border with South Carolina. And it's about 50-50 white and black, but slight majority black and Democratic. And when I first was doing my early reporting trips there to start just understanding like the psychology of living in Anson, I thought that I was going to a community that was majority black, where black folks held a lot of the local political and social power. And what I found was that even though they were the majority, much of the real power was held by white residents. And that, when I would talk to folks, on the side or just socially in between shoots, consistently they would describe to me a culture of hiding their real political opinions from their white neighbors in order to survive. That's how one person put it to me. That getting along, going along, required black people, even in a community where they are the majority, to not be totally honest about who they are every day, to not show up to work with their opinions, to not disagree with someone who maybe says something that they do privately find offensive in public. And just this idea of people living in this community and constantly chipping away at who they really are, or having to just keep that at home, really struck me. And it's a major goal of mine right now to figure out how to tell that story and to connect all the...
It's not hard to draw this line. You talk about Raven. Raven, you talked about the other woman who said, you know what, she wants to close the chapter, she wants to walk away from that. If 25 years later, she's living in you know what, I'm not gonna share my real views. I did that, I saw what happened to me in high school. So all of a sudden, I mean, my point is, when you were telling me that story, it's sort of like, well, this is what happens when you don't educate people on race when they're kids, is that you end up with a community like what you ran into, where black people feel like they have to hide in plain sight. I'm with you. I want to figure out how to make this story, because it's sort of like cause and effect, right? And there's something there to touch on. I just thought you guys would appreciate that. Mike, any final thoughts?
Well, I was going to say that that conversation made me think. There's also, from talking with people and just my own lived experience, school is also supposed to be preparing all students, including white students, to go out into the world. I grew up in a very rural, almost exclusively white town in Ohio, and there was no attempt at diversity education. Our history curriculum did not tell me the facts of American history, and it took me that was not a benefit to me as I left and went off to college. It was a handicap that I had to overcome over the course of a lot of stupid comments and conversations.
Look, I'm in the opposite. I grew up in Miami in the 70s and 80s when it was having these massive changes. Thank God I went through that. It's made me, I understand it better what's going on in the rest of America today. But in the same way, I didn't get the education in the school, by the way. It's
Right.
living in the community.
Right, sure.
Yeah.
But I'm just, I think that points to this is not just about whether or not white kids are going to be taught they're oppressors or black kids are inherently victims, which is the way conservatives have framed this, and that's how they define critical race theory. Regardless of what you call it, I think everyone can agree, and it's not a partisan thing to say that kids should be taught and prepared for the real world. And in a lot of schools, you're just not.
That's an interesting North Star, right? If you made that the North Star, is that something, preparing kids for the real world, is that something you think, Antonia, conservative parents could accept? If they saw it, if that was, hey, we're just trying to prepare your kids for the rest of the world, not just your little
it just
community.
brings me back to, different visions on what the real world might look like or be. But I think that's a phrase they'd get behind. I mean, and we did have some interesting conversations. It was hard to get conservative parents involved in the PAC in South Lake to sit down with us really thoroughly, but we got a couple folks to talk to us for the podcast. And, they would agree with that statement, but then they would describe a vision of America that was just so different from their black neighbors.
Colorblind.
A very colorblind version of America, a vision in which getting along with your neighbors requires saying you don't see their color or where they came from. And it's hard to figure, so you can get people to get behind the same sentence, but their interpretation of the couple words in it.
It's funny you bring up that phrase colorblind. Was that a mistake? I can't help but wonder, and that's a thing that my generation in some ways was educated with. Mm-hmm. And maybe that was maybe that wasn't the correct phrase. You're nodding. Tell me, Tiffany. I mean, right? I mean, it's sort of like, that's not the real world. We all experience through, I always say, people say, hey, you're biased. And I say, I have a pulse. I was born with original bias.
Right.
We all are.
Yeah, I was going to say, who isn't, right? And it's not that we aren't biased, it's what you do with it.
It's a great way of putting it. Well, you guys are a terrific audience. Those were really good questions.
Yep.
How about these reporters? Thank you, Tiffany.
Thank you.
And as guests, Tiffany, this library is amazing.
Thank you. We think
Thank you
so
for
too.
having us.
Thank you for
This
coming.
place is fantastic. To watch it over the last few years, it's been something else. Kudos.
Thank you. Thank you. We encourage you to come back and visit when we're open and, just explore. We have so many exhibits and opportunities for us to continue this conversation individually. So thank you all for being here.
Yeah, we could do a whole nother hour on the did we make a mistake with the phrase colorblind, right? So with that, that's your homework tonight. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.